A dive bomber is a bomber aircraft that dives directly at its targets in order to provide greater accuracy for the bomb it drops. Diving towards the target simplifies the bomb's trajectory and allows the pilot to keep visual contact throughout the bomb run. This allows attacks on point targets and ships, which were difficult to attack with conventional level bombers, even en masse. One dive bombing was especially effective against vehicles when integrated into early instances of blitzkrieg. After World War II, the rise of precision-guided munitions and improved anti-aircraft defenses, both fixed gunnery positions and fighter interception, led to a fundamental change in dive bombing. New weapons, such as rockets, allowed for better accuracy from smaller dive angles and from greater distances. They could be fitted to almost any aircraft, including fighters, improving their effectiveness without the inherent vulnerabilities of dive bombers, which needed air superiority to operate effectively. Method: dive fighter Junkers Ju-87 on the attack, often accompanied with screaming sound of the Lambjaret or Stuka siren. A dive bomber dives at a steep angle, normally between 45 and 60 degrees, or even up to a near vertical dive of 80 degrees with the Junkers Ju-87, and thus requires an abrupt pull-up after dropping its bombs. This puts great strains on both the pilot and aircraft. It demands an aircraft of strong construction, with some means to slow its dive. This limited the class to light bomber designs with ordnance loads in the range of 1,000 lb, 450 kg, although there were larger examples. The most famous examples are the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, short for Sturmkampfflugzeug dive fighter, which was widely used during the opening stages of World War II, often accompanied with the screaming sound of its sirens. The HID-3A Val dive bomber, which sank more Allied warships during the war than any other Axis aircraft, 234, and the Douglas SBD Dauntless, which sank more Japanese shipping than any other Allied aircraft type, 5. The SBD Dauntless helped win the Battle of Midway, was instrumental in the victory at the Battle of the Coral Sea, and fought in every U.S. battle involving carrier aircraft, 6-7. Final assembly view of SBD Dauntless dive bombers in 1943 at the Douglas Aircraft Company plant in El Segundo, California. The dive brakes are visible behind the wings. 8. An alternative technique, glide bombing, attacks made from an altitude of less than 8,000 feet and at an angle of less than 70 degrees 9, allowed the use of heavier aircraft, which faced far greater difficulties in recovering from near-vertical approaches, though it required greater use of sophisticated bomb sights and aiming techniques by a specialized member of air crews, namely a bombardier bomb aimer. The crews of multi-engine dive bombers, such as variants of the Junkers Ju-88 and Petliakov P-2, frequently use this technique. The heaviest aircraft to have dive bombing included in its design and development, the twin-engine Heinkel He-177, also utilized a glide bombing approach. The requirement that the He-177 be able to dive glide bomb delayed its development and impaired its overall performance. Dive bombing was most widely used before and during World War II. Its use declined during the war, when its vulnerability to enemy fighters became apparent. In the post-war era, this role was replaced with a combination of improved and automated bomb sights, larger weapons, and even nuclear warheads that greatly reduced the need for accuracy, and finally by precision-guided weapons as they became available in the 1960s. Most tactical aircraft today allow bombing in shallow dives to keep the target visible, but true dive bombers have not been a part of military forces since the start of the jet age. Accuracy. When released from an aircraft, a bomb carries with it the aircraft's trajectory. In the case of a bomber flying horizontally, the bomb will initially only be traveling forward. This forward motion is opposed by the drag of the air, so the forward motion decreases over time. Additionally, gravity causes the bomb to accelerate after it is dropped. The combination of these two forces, drag and gravity, results in a complex pseudo-parabolic trajectory. The distance that the bomb moves forward while it falls is known as its range. If the range for a given set of conditions is calculated, simple trigonometry can be used to find the angle between the aircraft and the target. By setting the bomb sight to this range angle, the aircraft can time the drop of its bombs at the instant when the target is lined up in the sight. This was only effective for area bombing, however, since the path of the bomb is only roughly estimated. Large formations could drop bombs on an area hopping to hit a specific target, but there was no guarantee of success, and huge areas around the target would also be hit. The advantage to this approach, however, was that it is easy to build such an aircraft and fly it at high altitude, keeping it out of range of ground-based defenses. The horizontal bomber was thus ill-suited for tactical bombing, particularly in close support. Attempts at using high-altitude bombing in near proximity to troops often ended in tragedy, with bombs both hitting their targets and friendly troops indiscriminately. In attacking shipping, the problems of inaccuracy were amplified by the fact that the target could be moving and could change its direction between the time that the bombs were released and the time that they arrived. Successful strikes on marine vessels by horizontal bombers were extremely rare. An example of this problem can be seen in the attempts to attack the Japanese carriers using B-17s at altitude in the Battle of Midway, with no hits scored. The German battleship Tirpitz was subjected to countless attacks, many while in dock and immobile, but was not sunk until the British brought in enormous 12,000 lb, 5,400 kg, tallboy bombs to ensure that even a near miss would be effective. An aircraft diving vertically minimizes its horizontal velocity component. When the bomb is dropped, the force of gravity simply increases its speed along its nearly vertical trajectory. The bomb travels a virtually straight line between release and impact, eliminating the need for complex calculations. The aircraft simply aims at the target and releases its bombs. The primary source of error is the effect of wind on the bomb's flight path after release. As bombs are streamlined and heavy, wind has only a slight effect on them, and the bomb is likely to fall within its lethal radius of the target. Bomb sighting becomes trivial, requiring only a straight line of sight to the target. This was simplified as the aircraft was pointed directly at the target, making sighting over the nose much easier. Differences in the path of different bombs due to differing ballistics can be corrected by selecting a standardized bombing altitude and then adjusting the dive angle slightly for each case. As the bomber dives, the aim could be continually adjusted. In contrast, when a horizontal bomber veers offline while approaching the bomb release point, turning to the angle that would correct this also changes the speed of the aircraft over the ground when there is a wind, and thereby changes the range as well. In the 1930s and early 1940s, dive bombing was the best method for attacking high-value compact targets, like bridges and ships, with accuracy. The forces generated when the aircraft levels out at the bottom of the dive are considerable. The drawback of modifying and strengthening an aircraft for near-vertical dives was the loss of performance. Aside from the greater strength requirements, during normal horizontal flight, aircraft are normally designed to return to fly straight and level. But when put into a dive, the changes in forces affecting the aircraft now cause the aircraft to track across the target, unless the pilot applies considerable force to keep the nose down, with a corresponding decrease in accuracy. To compensate, many dive bombers were designed to be trimmed out, either through the use of special dive flaps, such as Fairey-Youngman flaps, or through changes in tailplane trim that must be readjusted when the dive is completed. The Vulti-Vengeance, which was mostly used by the RAF and RAAF in Burma, was designed to be trimmed for diving, with no lift to distort the dive. The drawback was that it flew nose up in level flight, increasing drag. Failure to readjust trim made the aircraft difficult or impossible to pull out of a dive. 10. A dive bomber was vulnerable to low-level ground fire as it dived towards its target, since it was often headed in a straight line directly towards the defenders. At higher levels, this was less of a problem, as larger anti-aircraft shells were fused to explode at specific altitudes, which is impossible to determine while the plane is diving. In addition, most higher-altitude gunners and gunnery systems were designed to calculate the lateral movement of a target. While diving, the target appears almost stationary. Also, many AA mounts lacked the ability to fire directly up, so dive bombers were almost never exposed to fire from directly ahead. Dive brakes were employed on many designs to create drag, which slowed the aircraft in its dive and increased accuracy. Air brakes on modern aircraft function in a similar manner in bleeding off excessive speed. 11. Origins. It is difficult to establish how dive bombing originated. During World War I, the Royal Flying Corps, RFC, found its biplane two-seat bombers insufficiently accurate in operations on the Western Front. Commanders urged pilots to dive from their cruising altitude to under 500 ft, 150 m, to have a better chance of hitting small targets, such as gun emplacements and trenches. 12. As this exposed the aircraft and crew to destructive ground fire in their unprotected open cockpits, few followed this order. Some recorded altitude at the top and bottom of their dive in log books and in squadron records, but not the steepness of the dive. It was certainly not near vertical, as these early aircraft could not withstand the stresses of a sustained vertical dive. 13. The Royal Naval Air Service was bombing the Zeppelin sheds in Germany and in occupied Belgium and found it worthwhile to dive onto these sheds to ensure a hit, despite the increased casualties from ground fire. Again, the angle of dive in these attacks was not recorded. 12. Beginning on 18 June 1918, the Royal Air Force RAF, successor to the RFC, ordered large numbers of the Sopwith Salamander, a single-seat biplane. The TF stood for Trench Fighter, and the aircraft was designed to attack enemy trenches both with Vickers .303 machine guns and with 25 lb 11 kg bombs. Of the 37 Salamanders produced before the end of October 1918, only 2 were delivered to France, and the war ended before those saw action. 14. Whether the Salamander counts in more modern parlance as a fighter bomber or as a dive bomber depends on the definition of dive. It had armored protection for the pilot and a fuel system to attack at low level, but lacked dive brakes for a vertical dive. Heavy casualties resulting from air-to-ground attack on trenches set the minds of senior officers in the newly formed RAF against dive bombing. So not until 1934 did the Air Ministry issue specifications for both land-based and aircraft carrier-based dive bombers. The RAF canceled its requirement and relegated the Hawker-Henley dive bomber to other roles, while the Fleet Air Arm's Blackburn Skua was expected to do double duty, as a fighter when out of reach of land-based fighter support, and as a dive bomber. It had dive brakes that doubled as flaps for carrier landings. 15. The Hawker-Henley had a top speed only 50 mph, 80 km/h, slower than the Hawker Hurricane fighter from which it was derived. The American and Japanese navies and the Luftwaffe chose vertical dive bombers whose low speed had dire consequences when they encountered modern fighters. 13. World War I. The Royal Naval Air Service developed dive bombing as a tactic against Zeppelin hangars and formed and trained a squadron at Manchester for this task. On 8 October 1914, a Sopwith tabloid with 250 lb, 23 kg, bombs attacked a hangar at Dusseldorf after a dive to 600 ft, 180 m. On 14 November 1914, 4 Avro 504s attacked the Zeppelin factory at Friedrichshafen on Lake Constance, diving from 1,200 ft, 370 m, to 500 ft, 150 m, to ensure hits. As Zeppelins were tethered close to stores of hydrogen, results were often spectacular. 12. The first use of dive bombing by the RFC, which had been urging its pilots to drop bombs at heights below 500 ft, 150 m, in order to hit within 150 ft, 46 m of the target since February 1915, was later that year. On 27 November 1915, Lieutenant Duncan Grinnell Milne arrived in his Royal Aircraft Factory BE-2C over railway marshalling yards near Lies in northern France, to find the target already crowded by other bombers. He dived from 10,000 ft, 3,000 m, to 2,000 ft, 610 m, before releasing his 20 lb, 9.1 kg bombs. A few weeks later, Lieutenant Arthur Good dived to just 100 ft, 30 m, to hit buildings near Arras. 12. The Royal Flying Corps developed strafing with diving aircraft using both machine guns and small bombs as a deliberate tactic. At the Battle of Cambrai on 20 November 1917, 320 Mark IV tanks and 300 aircraft, mostly Sopwith Camels and Airco DH-5s with 20 lb, 9.1 kg bombs, were used to suppress artillery and machine guns. The cost in pilots was very high, with casualties on some days reaching 30%. 16. The initial impact at Cambrai was highly successful. The staff officer to the Royal Tank Corps, Lieutenant Colonel J.F. C. Fuller, published findings which were later taken up by Heinz Guderian to form the basis for the blitzkrieg tactics of using dive bombers with tanks employed by the Germans in 1939–40. 17. Second Lieutenant William Henry Brown, a Canadian from British Columbia serving with the RFC and flying a Royal Aircraft Factory SC-5A, made the first attack on a vessel on 14 March 1918, destroying an ammunition barge on a canal at Bernat near St. Quentin, diving to 500 ft, 150 m, to release his bombs. He was awarded the Military Cross for this and other exploits. 18. Brown's technique was emulated by other British squadrons. But the heavy casualties to unprotected pilots cast a pall over the results and influenced RAF thinking for 20 years. 13. Interwar era. The Royal Flying Corps was initially impressed with the potential of the dive bomber, but was aware of its suicidal nature. It ran a series of tests at the Armament Experimental Station at Orfordness in Suffolk. Sopwith Camels and Royal Aircraft Factory SC-5, as were used in early 1918 to dive bomb targets from various heights, with different bombs and without the use of the Aldi's gun sight, which had been invented in 1916 to aid pilots to calculate the deflection required to hit a traversing enemy aircraft. In principle, it obviated the need for a vertical dive. 19. The results showed that a vertical dive into the wind sighting along the top of rather than through the sight was best, but they were not considered good enough to justify the expected casualties. The Royal Air Force, which took over both Army and Naval aviation in April 1918, retired its Sopwith Salamander dive bombers at the end of the war. 14. Colonel, later General, Billy Mitchell arrived in France with the first U.S. Army and Air Force units soon after 6 April 1917 and began to organize the U.S. Army Air Force flying French Salmson IIs, a spotter plane. The later Salmson IV was to be a ground attack and dive bomber, but production was canceled at the end of the war. Mitchell became a strong advocate of dive bombers after witnessing British and French aerial attacks. 20. Mitchell, by now Assistant Chief of the Air Service United States Army, arranged tests with captured German and obsolete U.S. ships in June and July 1921, and repeated over the next 2 years using Royal Aircraft Factory SC-5 as dive bombers, and Handley Page 0400s and Martin NBS-1s as level bombers carrying bombs of different weights up to 2,000 lb. 910 kg. The SMS Ostfriesland was sunk, and so later were the USS Alabama, USS Virginia and USS New Jersey. 21. Opposite conclusions were drawn by the RAF and USAS from two very different tests regarding the usefulness of dive bombers, with the RAF concluding that the cost in pilots was too high to justify the results and the USAS considering it as a potent anti-ship weapon. Both naval staffs opposed the view taken by the respective airmen. 22. In 1919, United States Marine Corps, USMC, pilot Lt. L.H. Sanderson mounted a rifle in front of the windshield of his Curtiss JN-4, a training aircraft, as an improvised bomb site, loaded a bomb in a canvas bag attached to the aircraft's underside, and made a solo attack in support of USMC troops trapped by Haitians during the United States occupation of Haiti. Sanderson's bomb hit its target, and the raids were repeated. During 1920, Sanderson familiarized aviators of USMC units on the Atlantic coast with dive bombing techniques. 23. Dive bombing was also used during the United States occupation of Nicaragua. 24. As aircraft grew more powerful, dive bombing became a favored tactic, particularly against small targets such as ships. 22. The United States Navy overcame its hostility to Mitchell's findings and deployed the Curtiss F-8C Falcon biplane from 1925 on carriers, while the Marine Corps operated them from land bases as the Helderver, a name later reused by Curtiss for other dive bombers. The HID-1A2, a carrier-borne dive bomber. The Imperial Japanese Navy ordered the Heinkel He-50 in 1931 as a float plane and carrier-based dive bomber, and embarked some on new carriers from 1935 in a developed form as the Heinkel He-66, from which the HID-1A was further developed in Japan. The Luftwaffe confiscated a Chinese export shipment and ordered more. 25. Navies increasingly operated carriers, which had a limited number of aircraft available for attack, each with only a small bomb load. Targets were often likely to be small or fast-moving, and the need for accuracy made dive bombers essential. 22. Ernst Udet, a German First World War ace, persuaded Hermann Göring to buy 2 Curtiss Hawk IIs for the newly reformed Luftwaffe. Udet, then a stunt pilot, flew one in aerobatic displays during the 1936 Berlin Olympic Games. Due to his connections with the Nazi Party, he became the development director of the Ministry of Aviation, where he pushed for dive bomber development. 13. Dive bombing would allow a low-cost Luftwaffe to operate effectively in the tactical role. Against small targets, a single-engine dive bomber could achieve 4 times the accuracy at 1/10 of the cost of a 4-engine heavy bomber, such as the projected Ural bomber, 26, and it could reach the battlefield well ahead of field artillery. Soon the Luftwaffe issued a contract for its own dive bomber design, resulting in the Junkers K-47, which, following extensive trials, would in turn result in the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, a contraction of Sturzkampfflugzeug, literally diving combat airplane. 25. Several early Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers, which first flew on 13 September 1935, were shipped secretly from Germany to Spain to assist General Francisco Franco's nationalist rebels in the Spanish Civil War. Several problems appeared, including the tendency of the fixed undercarriage to sink into soft ground and an inability to take off with a full bomb load. The Condor Legion's experience in Spain demonstrated the value of dive bombers, especially on the morale of troops or civilians unprotected by air cover. 27. The aircraft did not encounter opposing modern fighters, which concealed its vulnerability from the Luftwaffe. Udet was impressed with the Stuka's performance in Spain, so he ordered that the Junkers Ju-88 medium bomber should also be retrofitted as a dive bomber. He also insisted, against the advice of Ernst Heinkel, that the Heinkel He-177 bomber, ordered in November 1937, be able to dive bomb. The lack of a sufficiently powerful, reliable powerplant fatally compromised its utility, and it never performed in the dive bomber role. The requirement was eventually dropped. 28. Some 23 Breda Ba 65s were flown by Italian pilots also in support of nationalist forces. First flown in 1935, it was a single-seat dive bomber carrying the same bomb load as the Stuka with a 30 mph, 48 km/h speed advantage in level flight. 29. As the Royal Navy again took control of the Fleet Air Arm, it began to receive the Fairey Swordfish from 1936 and Blackburn Skuas from November 1938. The Skua had a secondary function 30 of intercepting attacks by unescorted long-range bombers. With 4.303 Browning guns and another rear-facing gun, it was expected to defend against air attack with a top speed of 225 mph, 362 km/h, at sea level, 15, which was a low-altitude speed comparable with other Navy's carrier-borne fighters in 1938-39. 31. The Royal Navy's dedicated, pre- and early war fleet fighter was the Gloucester Sea Gladiator. The Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, Mitsubishi A5M and USN Grumman F3F were nominally faster than the Skua, but this speed was achieved at much higher altitudes. At low altitudes, the Skua was quite comparable in speed and was also better armed. The Swordfish was also capable of operating as a dive bomber, and in 1939, HMS Glorious used her Swordfish for a series of dive bombing trials, during which 439 practice bombs were dropped at dive angles of 60, 67, and 70 degrees against the target ship HMS Centurion. Tests against a stationary target showed an average error of 49 wide, 45 m, from a release height of 1,300 ft, 400 m, and a dive angle of 70 degrees. Tests against a maneuvering target showed an average error of 44 wide, 40 m, from a drop height of 1,800 ft, 550 m, and a dive angle of 60 degrees. 32. The Fairey Albacore was also designed to act as a dive bomber and was used extensively in this role during World War. The British Air Ministry issued Specification 434 in 1934 for a ground attack aircraft with dive bombing capability. The Hawker Henley was a two-seat version of the Battle of Britain-winning Hawker Hurricane. It was fast, at almost 300 mph, 480 km/h at sea level, and 450 mph, 720 km/h, in a dive, but development was delayed when hurricane development took priority. Just 200 were built and it was relegated to target towing. 34. The RAF ordered the U.S.-built Vultee A-31 Vengeance in 1943, but it too was similarly relegated to target towing after a brief operation period in secondary theaters. Citation needed. The Curtiss SBC Helderver was a biplane dive bomber that had been taken aboard the USS Yorktown, CV-5, in 1934, but it was slow, at 234 mph, 377 km/h. 50 ex-US Navy examples were flown to Halifax, Nova Scotia, by Curtiss pilots and embarked on the French aircraft carrier Bayarn in a belated attempt to help France, which surrendered while they were mid-Atlantic. 5 airframes left behind in Halifax later reached the RAF, which quickly relegated them to the status of ground instructional airframes for the training of mechanics. 35. The Japanese introduced the HID-3A Val monoplane as a successor to the biplane HID-1A in 1940, with trials aboard the carriers Kaga and Akagi. It was to prove a potent weapon against surface ships. 29. Only the Wehrmacht learned from the Battle of Cambrai, 1917, in using dive bombers in conjunction with tanks. The writings of Britain's Colonel J.F.C. Fuller, a staff officer, and Basil Liddell-Hart, a military journalist, propounded the concept of mobile tank forces supported by ground attack aircraft creating a breakthrough. These were eagerly studied by the German army officer Heinz Guderian, who created the combination of panzers and dive bombers that later proved so potent in Poland and France. The Ju-87 Stuka could be used as aerial artillery, moving far ahead of the main forces with panzers to smash enemy strong points without waiting for the horse-drawn artillery to catch up. It was central to the concept of blitzkrieg, which required close coordination between aircraft and tanks by radio. 17. The RAF had chosen the single-engined Ferry Battle and the twin-engined Bristol Blenheim as its tactical bombers. Both were level bombers with similar bomb loads and entered service in 1937. The U.S. Army Air Corps, USAAC, adopted the Douglas A-20 Havoc, first flying in January 1939, for a similar role, although originally ordered by France. Many were also supplied to the Soviet Air Force, which also used the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft in huge numbers. None of these were dive bombers. No Allied Air Force operated a modern dive bomber at the outbreak of the Second World War, although both the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy had shipboard dive bombers. 29. European theater. Ju Stukas over the Eastern Front, December 1943. On 10 April 1940, 16 British Royal Navy Blackburn skuas flying at extreme range from the Naval Air Station at Hatston in Orkney, led by Lieutenant Commander William Lucy, sank the German cruiser Königsberg in Bergen Harbor, whilst trying to prevent the German invasion of Norway. 36. On the German side, Stukas augmented or replaced artillery support for the Wehrmacht's lightly armed parachute and airborne troops. The invasion of Poland, September to October 1939, and the Battle of France, May to June 1940, saw the Stuka used to devastating effect. German blitzkrieg tactics used dive bombers in place of artillery to support highly mobile ground troops. The British Expeditionary Force had set up strong defensive positions on the west bank of the Oise River to block rapidly advancing German armor. Stukas quickly broke the defenses, and the Wehrmacht forced a crossing long before German artillery arrived. 27. On 12-13 May 1940, Stukas flew 300 sorties against strong French defensive positions at the Battle of Sedan. This enabled German forces to make a fast and unexpected breakthrough of the French lines, eventually leading to the German advance to the Channel and the cutting off of much of the Allied army. 27. The skis over Sedan also showed the Stuka's weakness when met with fighter opposition. 6 French Curtiss H-75s attacked a formation of unescorted Ju-87s and shot down 11 out of 12 without loss. 37. The Stuka was even more vulnerable to the Hawker Hurricane with its 100 mph, 160 km/h, speed edge and 8 machine guns, which at first met over France and then in larger numbers in the Battle of Britain, July to October 1940. Losses were such that the Luftwaffe rapidly withdrew Stukas from operations over the United Kingdom. A similar fate befell unescorted RAF ferry battles over France. 27. The Stuka had 7.92 machine guns or 20 cannons mounted in the wings. Some were modified to destroy tanks with heavy caliber. 37 Bordkannon BK-37 autocannons mounted in gun pods below the wings. They were very successful in this role in the early days, 1941, of Operation Barbarossa before the Red Army Air Force countered with modern fighters, such as the Yakovlev Yak-1 and later the Yakovlev Yak-3. 38. The most successful dive bomber pilot, Hans-Ulrich Rudel, made 2,530 sorties. He contributed to the sinking of the Soviet battleship Marat at Kronstadt on 23 September 1941, using 1,000 kg, 2,200 lb bombs. Later, flying a tank-buster Stuka with 20 cannon, he claimed over 100 Soviet tanks destroyed, mostly at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. The Ju-87G Kannonenvogel, equipped with two 37 BK-37 anti-tank guns, as suggested by Rudel, proved to be a lethal weapon in skilled hands. In the Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Kutuzov, July to August 1943, which concluded Kursk, the Luftwaffe claimed 35 tanks destroyed in a single day. 39. Rudel co-wrote a post-war book about his experiences and consulted with the U.S. Air Force 40.